As a medium, photography serves as a space to literally create your own image. Throughout history, the way Black Americans are portrayed in the media is often the source of controversy. In media and photography, there is often a distortion of Black subjects with the result of perpetuating negative stereotypes. The worst damage from these negative stereotypes doesn't come from other races, however, but from internal discourse created amongst ourselves and the Black community. The first known African American photographer was Jules Lyon. He opened a daguerreotype studio in New Orleans in 1840, only 1 year after the invention of the process. In 1842, Jules Lyon completed a lithograph of the 700 block of Chartres Street in New Orleans, including the St. Louis Cathedral. Along with Jules Lyon, the other pioneer of Black photography was James Presley Ball. James Presley Ball gained recognition after publishing an anti-slavery pamphlet in 1855. The pamphlet depicted the devastating consequences of slavery, and he also held photo exhibitions showcasing the experience of slavery. Ball opened a one-room daguerreotype studio in Cincinnati, Ohio in 1845. Ball then opened the separate Ball and Thomas Gallery with his brother-in-law Alexander Thomas. Among the subjects of Ball's photographic portraits were P.T. Barnum, Charles Dickens, Henry Highland Garnet, the family of Ulysses S. Grant, Jenny Lind, and Queen Victoria.
During the time after the Civil War, whites produced fake photographs that began to form stereotypes around African Americans. These stereotypes consisted of African Americans committing crimes, only consuming watermelon, acting stupid, or harming others. Subsequently, these photos tarnished the view of African Americans. Thankfully, there were those who tried to stand up for their image and identity, namely the Goodrich brothers. These two try to uphold the idea of community and family amongst African Americans. The Goodrich brothers were among the first African American photographers to operate professionally in the nation. They began to photograph their families and friends together and even took it a step further and placed their photos in an album of other photographs. This album stood as an overall representation of their image. It was meant to solidify the truth of their cultural identity. Shortly after the Goodrich brothers had appeared, 3 other very influential figures came about who also knew how to use photography to their culture's advantage.
Newly freed Blacks recognized the opportunity to take their family history into their own hands. Frederick Douglass recognized the impact photography would have on Blacks and their image right away and promoted photography as a skill that distinguished men from animals and that could serve as the primary catalyst for social change.
Booker T. Washington was a man of great intelligence, who not only ran the Tuskegee University, but pushed his fellow man and woman to identify themselves through their art. Following this trend, Washington had a photography studio installed at Tuskegee, where students could learn and practice the art of photography. Washington used photography as one of his main tools when it came to navigating through the Jim Crow era of the United States history. He saw photography as a medium to produce different identities in unorthodox ways, and used these identities as a form of demonstrating his people's truths. Photography was Washington's way of spreading knowledge amongst his people when it came to the grouping of social order. W.E.B. Du Bois was also a man of great intelligence, becoming the first African American to graduate from Harvard. He was a great ally and friend of Booker T. Washington. However, he was a man who was much more straightforward when it came to Black identity. This quality led W.E. Du Bois to put on the Exhibit of American Negroes in 1900 in the World's Fair held in Paris, France. At the exhibit, Du Bois wrote that the problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line. Du Bois exhibited 3 albums which contained 363 black and white photographs, mainly made up of middle-class African Americans. These photographs then were contrasted by photos of criminal mugshots of African Americans, racist cartoons, and lynching photographs. Du Bois's idea for this exhibit to display these contrasting images serves as a protest against the racist depictions of African Americans. This led to the government to withdraw from future art exhibits that Washington and Du Bois had planned back in the States. This also led to the elimination of all contemporary African American presence, which further pushed the idea of there not being any black photographers in the 1800s and 1900s. Today, however, there are a number of young black artists rising to fame with their ability to capture the African American identity through the medium of photography.
Born on June 29, 1886 in Lenox, Massachusetts, James Vanderzee developed a passion for photography at an early age and opened up his own Harlem studio in 1960. James Vanderzee's work is particularly noted for his pioneering depiction of middle-class African-American life. Van der Zee took thousands of pictures, mostly indoor portraits, and labeled each of his photos with a signature and a date, which would prove to be important for future documentation. Van der Zee's photos sometimes contained special effects from the result of darkroom manipulation. In one image, a 1920 photograph titled Future Expectations, a young couple is presented in bride and groom finery, with a ghostly, transparent image of a child at their feet. Along with the middle class, Van der Zee captured a lot of the arts, music, celebrities, and in general the raw culture of the Harlem Renaissance in his photography. Jamel Shabazz is an African-American fashion, fine art, and documentary photographer. Back in the days, one of Jamel Shabazz's most well-known series presents a collection of photos from the golden era of hip-hop in the 1980s. These photos have a focus on style and emphasize music versus today's largely violent and gangster rap. One of the emerging problems with hip-hop focused photography and the projection of the hip-hop lifestyle by the media is its effect to form stereotypes. In The Souls of Black Folk, W.B. Du Bois describes double conscious as the sense of always looking at oneself through the eyes of others, and thereby situates a visual model of subjectivity at the center of what he calls the strange meaning of being black in the United States at the turn of the century.
One modern-day African-American photographer is Brent Lewis. Lewis comments that in recent years, the number of black photographers has greatly diminished. Lewis compares the photographers of then and now and says that he finds himself able to name almost every photographer of yesteryear, but very few of today's photographers. Lewis feels the need to tell the story of his people for others. It was intuitive to immerse myself in the work of Gordon Parks. It struck a chord. He was telling our story, my story. After that, I transferred and ran to John H. White. John was doing the same thing. He was telling our stories. Telling stories in a way people usually don't tell our stories. Or for that matter, for most people of color. The good, the bad, the ugly, the sweet, the kind, and that is something you don't see. Lewis tries to embrace this old, rarely used perspective on photography to further strengthen the idea of the African American people and culture. He's trying to remind his viewers of the history and truth in his culture, while also trying to understand it. Hank Willis Thomas also tries to challenge both the idea of branding a culture and the idea of self-image and identity, but most importantly, how America views African Americans. His photography is straightforward, edgy, controversial, and in your face. The majority of his work deals with the manipulation of advertisements. Thomas will take away logos or slogans from ads, leaving only the black individual. Sometimes Thomas decides to tweak them, or sometimes he leaves the photo to speak for themselves. But one thing that is for certain is his art will always deal with race. This type of photography, much like Du Bois's exhibit in Paris, serves to have the viewer not only question branding of advertisements, but branding of themselves and branding of race. Thomas sees these ads as brainwashing in a way that trains and forces humans to see people, culture, and lifestyle in a certain way, and these ads are constant, making these ideas constant. These ads in Thomas's eyes create an image and branding of the African American people and their culture that just isn't true or right. As a rightful response, Thomas then manipulates these everyday ads to have the viewer question what these ads are actually trying to say.
Currently, when focusing on blacks, media often emphasizes poverty over the middle class and despair and violence over acts of positivity. With photography, there lies the power to show the change you want to see become the norm. At the heart of black photography is the desire for us to create our own image, one of positivity and through our own eyes. Currently, like other photography, black photography has merged into mixed media. As time goes on and photography becomes more digital and places such as Facebook replace family albums, it's going to be even more critical to battle the onslaught of the negative images of blacks cluttering on the internet. It's the duty of future mixed media artists and photographers to put forth images to help provide self-appropriation for us as a people.